And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on YouTube and on Pacifica Radio Network and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and more. And you can find all the archives at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. And I'm very pleased to have back on the show Ward Wilson. He's a senior fellow and director of the Rethinking Nuclear Weapons Project at the British American Security Information Council, a think tank focusing on nuclear disarmament based in London and Washington. A think tank focusing on nuclear disarmament based in London and Washington, D.C. He's the author of the book, 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. We go back at least 15 years, I'd say. And It's great to have you back. Your website is realistrevolt.org, REALIST, revolt.org. And you've kind of been dedicating your life to getting rid of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It's a long road. Yeah. And I want to add that since I met you, you have done some really good things have happened. You got funding for close to $1 million over the course of 6 years from the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and they've taken you all over the world and helped you meet some pretty influential people like generals and heads of state.
Yeah, I traveled to 23 countries on 5 continents, and at one time I was acquaintances with 3 foreign ministers, and I've met more generals than I can shake a stick at, and talked to kids in church basements and speeches in parliaments. So yeah, it's been wild. The story that I like to tell most about doing a talk was a talk I gave at the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish National Parliament. So most of the PMs go to London, the Scots, and where they do the UK Parliament. But the Scots have their own local parliament, and where they do local issues and social legislation and so on. And they had a debate about nuclear weapons. They invited me on August 5th. There were 20 parliamentarians in the room, which is the largest collection of legislators I've ever given a talk to. And the next day, August 6th, which some people will recognize as the date that Hiroshima was bombed, they had their debate on nuclear weapons, which was pretty sly timing on their part. And they recounted the arguments from 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. And the chief whip actually stood up and gave a speech and said, "And Ward Wilson is here in the gallery." And I stood up, and, you know, it was a tremendous honor, but it's also kind of weird. It's like when people sing happy birthday to you, you don't really know what to do. You know, you kind of like a wave, or I don't know, something. It was remarkable.
It's all part of the effort to change the world. And the reality is that you don't know what single thing you're going to do that is going to be the lever that causes the change to happen. So you got to put throw a lot of it against the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah. And certainly influencing parliamentarians in Scotland is, you know, they're the ones who are thinking about they're pushing for independence from the UK because they're mad that the British are basing their submarines in Scotland. And so the Scots, who are more progressive than the United Kingdom as a whole, are mad about having to base these submarines, and, you know, in a nuclear war, they get targeted, and yet they don't really have a say because the UK makes a decision. So,
right.
one of the issues.
So you, as I mentioned, you wrote the book, and the book is 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. And you had a website that was different, and you changed the name of the website to Realist Revolt. Talk about what happened there.
Well, I kept the original website. The original website was called Rethinking Nuclear Weapons. And I felt like my own personal evolution was, there was this long period where I spent time trying to understand nuclear weapons and the underlying ideas and why we have them and, you know, what they're good for. And at some point, a couple of years ago, I had this kind of revelation that the time for thinking was over. That, you know, I don't see all the way to the bottom of the issue, but I can see far enough to know that it's time to act now. And so rather than this kind of contemplative rethinking idea, which I kept the website up, it's still there. It's just not, I don't use it. I founded a grassroots organization. I left BASIC, the British American Security Information Council think tank, and I'm now the director of a grassroots organization. I'm trying to do a little bottom-up organizing.
What's the name of the organization, and what's the
Realist Revolt?
Realist Revolt. Okay.
And the basic idea is, so a little background. In nuclear weapons, there's one thing that matters. There's one framework of ideas that controls the debate. And that is that currently almost everyone believes that the people who are in favor of nuclear weapons are realists, and the people who are opposed to nuclear weapons are idealists. And of course, whenever there's a real risk, you always want to have a realist. You always want to be following the advice of a realist, because if you're in danger of dying, you don't want to go off on some kind of fantastic, hopeful, idealistic risk and course of action. So this controls the debate today, and it ensures that the proponents of nuclear weapons will always win, because they claim that they're the realists, and that's a claim that by and large isn't challenged. So the whole thrust, and why it's called Realist Revolt, and I'm writing a new book. I've written a new book. I'm waiting to get it published. The whole thrust of it is that the people who are in favor of nuclear weapons aren't realists. They claim they're realists. They think they're realists. They're weapons romantics. They're so infatuated with the weapons that they've twisted reality, and that they obscure the facts and ignore uncomfortable contradictions and all the rest. So that's why it's called Realist Revolt, because it's time for the real realists, the genuine realists, the people who oppose nuclear weapons, to stand up and say, look, you guys aren't realists. You know, you believe in all this nonsense.
Okay. So you have a working title for the new book. What's that working title?
Well, before we came on air, you were just saying I should change it. The working title is From Gods to Tools, although you said Ending Nuclear Delusion would be better, and you know, there's something to be said for that.
Well, what I said was you should probably come up with 10 different titles, because the publisher's going to decide anyway. And
they're going to change it, yeah. No, the reason I called it From Gods to Tools is that the basic idea is that we treat nuclear weapons as gods. They're symbols far more than actual military tools. And their symbolic role in our lives is far greater than their military role, obviously, since they haven't been used in 70 years. And so we you know, as long as we see nuclear weapons as gods, we'll never get rid of them, because how could you get rid of the power that's greater than all other powers?
And in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, I cite you, and what you got me to think is that nuclear weapons are the ultimate top-down fantasy. You know, I talk to people, and they will refer to like a problem area. It could be Iraq, could be Palestinians, it could be Iran and Syria, and they go, we should nuke the BAST asterisk RDS. And I mean, people say it so often, and it's ridiculous, it's stupid, and I call them on it. I go, you're being ridiculous. It's nonsense. You really want to do that to everybody who lives there? Yeah, but that's really what the idea of a nuclear bomb is all about.
There's two things at work there. One is that they're talking symbolically, not realistically. Obviously, they're not thinking realistically. So they're thinking of nuclear weapons as symbols of power. So we ought to use our symbol of power, our greatness, to attack them. And the other is, I completely agree that the problem with nuclear weapons is that they give the advocates of nuclear weapons this feeling that they are gods, that they hold this tool that could wipe out countries or whatever. So that's a serious delusion to have.
Why is it a delusion?
Because nuclear weapons don't supply godlike power. They're actually pretty crappy tools. Weapons are a subset of tools. Tools are implements you use to get things done. Weapons are implements that we use to create violence, usually to kill or hurt people. And the way that you evaluate tools is situationally. Some tools work in some situations, but don't work in others. So a tool's utility depends on on its characteristics and how those characteristics apply to different situations. So it's great to have a credit card in Manhattan. It's not so useful to have a credit card on a desert island. It's great to have a knife unless your opponent has a 6-foot sword. I mean, it's great to have an artillery piece unless you're underwater. So you need the tool that's appropriate for the situation. So the real question about nuclear weapons is, when are they the best tool for the job? And the fact is, we imagine that the biggest tool for the job is always the best tool, because we have this intuitive kind of bias towards bigness, but that's not true. When a workman sends his assistant to the truck to get a tool, he doesn't say, Darren, get me the biggest tool for the job. He says, Darren, get me the right tool for the job. Fact is, nuclear weapons are too big for almost any job. You want to destroy a building in a city, you got to destroy 3/4 of the city to do it. There are all these unintended consequences. You want to knock out a radar array, you can do that, but when you destroy the radar array, you're going to spread radiation poison 100 or 1,000 miles downwind. They're clumsy weapons. People always say, well, there's the reason that they haven't been used for 70 years is that they're this godlike, awesome. The fact is, if they were really awesome weapons, we'd have used them to win the war in Vietnam. The Russians would have used them to win the war in Afghanistan. They would have been useful, but they aren't useful. And that's why they haven't been used. So, I forgot where I was going with this.
Well, you're talking about tools and how useful the tools are.
Okay. So the end result is they're They're lousy weapons, and there are lots of historical examples of that could, we could go over if you were. I'm a historian, so I love the historical examples. But the point is, you have these tools, they're not very useful, so why do we keep them? And people say, well, we keep them for deterrence. And it's okay if they're just symbols because we need them for deterrence. And there's no question nuclear weapons work as a deterrent some of the time. The problem is they're going to fail one day. It's not me saying they're going to fail. It's not a guess that they're going to fail. It's absolutely inevitable that they will fail.
Fail? What do you mean fail?
Deterrence is going to fail. And the fact that it's going to fail is as simple as 3 sentences of logic and human nature, as inevitable as human nature. So human beings are fallible. No one's perfect, from the lowest private to the highest leader. Human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence. We make the threats. We evaluate the threats. We respond to the threats. We're part of the process at every step. The nuclear deterrence isn't like a computer that sits in some, temperature-controlled room by itself and kind of whirs away unattended. We're involved at every step.
What is nuclear deterrence?
Deterrence is, if you attack me, I'll hit you back hard and hurt you. And the theory is that if I say I'm going to hit you hard enough, you won't do whatever it is I didn't want you to do.
That's not exactly. Keep going. What is? That's not really a full description. That's it. That's what the words are. But what is nuclear deterrence? What is the process? What is the nature of it? How do you think about it?
Well, that's the problem. See, let's say you were going to steal my car, and you called me up and said, Ward, I'm going to steal your car. And I said, Rob, if you do that, I'll throw a firebomb through your study window. So now I'm trying to deter you from stealing my car. And you then spend some time thinking, well, can he really do that? Does he have a firebomb? Do I think he's crazy enough to do something like that? Would someone stop him? So you evaluate the threat, and then you decide whether or not you're going to be deterred. But here's the problem. In order for deterrence to work, something has to happen inside your head. But the problem with inside your head is it's a place we don't know very much about. There's no way to get a ruler inside your head to measure what's going on. And remember, truth is only objective if you could measure it, test it, and other people can reproduce the results. So the problem with nuclear deterrence is that it is a process that goes on inside a black box. We know nothing about it, nothing objective. We have no scientific information about whether it works, how it works, when it works, if it works. All we know is that sometimes in history, it seems to have worked. Sometimes people claim that they were deterred, sometimes not. And leaders have a built-in desire to lie to you about it, because no one wants to say, yeah, I was scared out of my wits and I was deterred. That's not the way national leaders want to be remembered. So they have an incentive to lie about any historical case of deterrence. You never really know what happened. So here's this process that people treat like it's a real thing, nuclear deterrence. And they write academic papers and there's all this stuff like it's a real physical object. In fact, it's this mysterious process we know nothing about, nothing concrete, nothing objective. We are risking the safety and security of 4.2 billion human beings. Russia, China, India, the United States, Europe, on a process that we know nothing about. Everything we know is speculation. It's intuition. It's hunch. We're betting the lives of 4.2 billion people on some hunches. There's no question nuclear deterrence works.
We're betting the lives of 4.2 billion people.
If nuclear deterrence fails, here's what happens. Nuclear deterrence fails, you're in the middle of a crisis, somebody's threatening nuclear weapons, and somebody ignores that threat. And then what's happened so far in history, Kennedy, for instance, Khrushchev puts missiles into Cuba, and he threatens nuclear war if Kennedy does anything about it. And not directly. I mean, part of the problem is that until you get Kim Jong-un, almost no one says a nuclear threat explicitly out loud. They don't say, if you do X, I'll do Y. They always say, if you continue with your terrible aggression, I might have to have recourse to terrible measures of unbelievable force or some euphemism. So anyway, I get distracted again. Where was I?
You're talking about 4.2 billion.
Oh, right. And so here's what happens. So Kennedy says, okay, Khrushchev's putting missiles, nuclear weapons into Cuba. I know there's a risk of nuclear war if I do anything about it. In the secret meetings that they had where they talked about what they were going to do, they mentioned the risk of nuclear war. They mentioned nuclear war 58 times. So they were thinking about it. They knew it was a danger. After the crisis was over, Kennedy said to an aide, the risk of nuclear war, the probability of nuclear war from the Cuban Missile Crisis was anywhere between 1 in 3 and 50-50. So he knew there was this danger. Yeah. And yet he went ahead and did something. He blockaded Cuba. He did the less aggressive of two options, but nuclear deterrence still failed to keep him from taking action. He wasn't deterred. And what happens, deterrence is like your brakes failing on your car. And what happens when your brakes fail is that you are at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. You might die, you might not. I mean, maybe there are no other cars in the road when your brakes fail. Maybe there's a big open field.
What I'm trying to get in my head is like a definition of deterrence without using the word deter or deterrence. And from what you've said, deterrence is the process of the effort to intimidate or threaten to prevent an adversary from doing something.
Yeah, it's a threat. It's a threat of harm.
And what you're saying is that deterrence requires a state of mind in your adversary, a state of belief, and you're saying it doesn't work. Well,
it's not that deterrence doesn't work. What I'm saying is we don't know what's going on inside the head of when deterrence, quote unquote, works, you have no idea what happened.
You know, when you talk about this, it makes me think of our current state of idiocracy with the malignant narcissist psychopath and chief who holds the football in the White House. And yeah, I mean, deterrence, it might not work if you think that the crazy MF is going to do it at any time. You know, it may be, well, let's do it first. I mean, right. I mean, would you agree that we're probably closer right now to engaging in nuclear war than we've been in decades? Maybe since the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah, I think international tensions are lower than at the height of the Cold War, but the crazy factor of the leaders involved, and I include Putin and Kim Jong-un and President Trump and, you know, all the various actors, the crazy factor of the leaders is much higher.
Modi, let's put Modi in there too.
Sure, absolutely. And And so, yeah, I think the danger of nuclear war is extremely high. I mean, talking about nuclear weapons is a little like trying to sell life insurance. You're always trying to get people to face a mortality that they're uncomfortable with. So it's not always easy to talk about this stuff because it's unpleasant. But, you know, I think realistically, the chances that you and I will disappear in a fireball, or at least I'm likely to go in a fireball, you'd probably go to radiation poisoning from Philadelphia.
You're in Chicago, so you're more likely to get hit.
Northern Chicago, there's an Army base, a naval training facility a little bit north of us that probably would do us if we didn't get, you know, direct hits from Chicago. So I think
lucky me, only radiation poisoning. That'll give me a couple days, a couple weeks.
Yeah. No,
but this is the kind of thinking that keeps nuclear weapon investment going, though, right?
Well, if you believe that having more nuclear weapons will prevent somebody from attacking you, then yeah, except we don't. Here's the thing. Let me go back to this thing I was saying earlier. So if human beings are fallible, if they're prone to folly, and clearly they are, and if they're involved in nuclear deterrence, and they are, then nuclear deterrence is inherently flawed. It will fail. And one of the times when it fails, it's like having your brakes on your car fail over and over. One of the times when the brakes fail, you'll be driving along next to a cliff and you'll go sailing off into the ravine and die. We've been lucky. You know, McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, Robert McNamara, said after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the only thing that kept the United States alive was luck, because the Cuban Missile Crisis could have blown up at any number of different points. So anyway.
And so we have more and more countries attempting to become nuclear powers.
Slowly, yeah. I mean, it's not like everyone's racing to get them. And in fact, there's this thing that nuclear believers say, everyone wants nuclear weapons. They say this all the time. And it's been kind of accepted for 60 years or 50 years as the truth. But in a true kind of bottom-up, revolutionary kind of moment, that's been proved not to be true. Not everyone wants nuclear weapons. And I remember the moment when I realized it. It made the hair stand up on the back of my head. I was at a conference in Nayarit, Mexico, with probably 140 representatives from 140 nations there. And they were talking about nuclear weapons. It was the second in a series of conferences that led to the vote in the UN for the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And the first conference was kind of stiff and everyone wasn't sure that they were allowed to talk. But the second conference, it was the second day, we were supposed to have comments from, we'd seen all these videos about the medical dangers and the radiation and stuff, humanitarian consequences. And it was a period when any diplomat from the floor could comment and say, you know, kind of, here's my wrap-up comment about the conference. And we were going to end at about 2, get a statement from the chair, and then we were done. And it kept going. People kept raising their hand. Representatives from little countries in Asia, African representatives, representatives from Latin America, and they had shorter statements or longer statements, impassioned statements, diplomatic statements, and it went on and on and on. And it was amazing to see. For 70 years, the nuclear armed states have said, whenever the subject comes up, we got this. You don't have to talk about nuclear weapons. we'll handle this. You just sit there and look pretty. And on that day, on that afternoon, you could hear that exclusion cracking, because representatives from countries all around the world stood up. I remember one representative from an African nation. He was about 35, or he was in his mid-30s, and he was so passionate. He said, these countries that have these weapons, they hold all of us at risk. It is wrong. It's just wrong. And it wasn't surprising that 2 years later, when the UN brought the subject up for a vote, 122 countries voted in favor of a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And at that moment, it no longer became possible to say that everyone really wants nuclear weapons, because all of the non-nuclear armed states had been given a voice. They'd found their voice. And that was when people who've been excluded find their voices, it's a powerful moment. So I think—
How many countries voted against that resolution?
Only one, but like a bunch abstained or voted not, present but not voting or something.
Which one voted against it?
I think it was the Netherlands, because they have a nuclear weapons base on their territory. I don't know. I could be wrong on the details.
And besides, it could be about surrogacy. It could be—
What do you mean?
It could be that the U.S. said, we need you to vote against it if you're going to—
Oh yeah.
Your $800 million in funding or whatever.
There was a lot of pressure from the U.S. State Department on everyone who to vote against it, to oppose it. In fact, one of the things that shows how powerful this is that it has united the main nuclear weapons states. I mean, China and the U.S. and India and Pakistan and Russia generally don't have a lot in common. But
so what is your new book say? What that first book didn't?
First book said, here's some contradictions. Here's some stuff from history you don't know. Dropping the bomb at Hiroshima didn't win the war. Here's some reasons to doubt nuclear weapons, but I'm not sure what the next step is. And this book says, we got to eliminate nuclear weapons. It's got to be done. There's no other way to go to solve this problem. The weapons aren't very good, and nuclear deterrence will inevitably fail one day, and then we'll end up in a catastrophic war, and there'll be 400 million dead and, a huge hole in civilization.
If there's anything left at all.
There's 770 million people in the Southern Hemisphere, and estimated. And there aren't any nuclear weapons in the Southern Hemisphere. So, Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, New Zealand, but they'd probably survive. There might be nuclear winter, there might not. Different experts disagree. And predicting what, climatic impacts is hard, but although we're getting better at it, some people would probably survive for sure. It would be an entirely different civilization. We'd have destroyed the Prado and the Louvre, and all the works of Western civilization would be burned, and most of the business records, most of the property ownership stuff, most of the wealth would be destroyed, and a lot of scientific advances would go away. Techniques for saving lives or for medicines and so on would be destroyed. But I don't think I used to say that nuclear weapons would be an apocalypse and it would be the end of everything. But at one point I realized that is disempowering. Because here's the thing, if nuclear war is the apocalypse, then by definition, only God can do something about it, because only God can bring about or stop an apocalypse. So I think nuclear war would be really bad, but I don't think it would be the end of everything. And if 400 million dead isn't enough to get you motivated to do something about the problem, there's a guy in the White House you probably like.
Wow.
Yeah, it's serious stuff.
Yeah, it is. And
yeah.
What are the obstacles to getting rid of nuclear weapons?
The main thing is that there's this belief system. It's like a religion. And nuclear policy is controlled by a very small group of experts and government officials. I think if you got the main people, and they're mostly guys, but there's some women now, they're starting to branch out. If you got all the experts and government officials in one place, the really important ones, you probably would not fill the main venue at Carnegie Hall, which holds 2,000 plus people. So the number of people who are making the decisions is quite small. They're quite insulated. They don't talk to ordinary Americans in general. They don't debate this publicly.
So how do they have so much power? How do they get the rest of the world to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear weapons every year?
Well, they talk the governments into believing that they're the experts.
So how do we get the government to start thinking that they are fools, liars, and idiots?
Well, because we do exactly what you have written so eloquently about, which is you explain the situation to ordinary people in simple language, and you give them arguments that any 12-year-old can put forward, because Greta Thunberg has shown us that you don't have to be an old person to be able to have an impact. So, and then you turn them loose and you do grassroots work and you vote Congress people out of office and you have resolutions and you have demonstrations and, it's our lives on the line. So,
well, talking about demonstrations, you recently wrote a piece that I published in opednews.com about some nuclear protesters, and it's not looking good for them.
Well, it's a measure of how much the people who believe in nuclear weapons, how they feel about it and how much they want to protect their ideas. So here's 7 Catholic, mostly religious and peace activists. They broke into the Kings Bay Naval Facility in Georgia, and they put up some leaflets and they spray painted some graffiti, and they used a hammer to bang on a statue of a Trident missile. And they're facing 25 years in jail for that. And it's a measure of how sacred the nuclear believers think nuclear weapons are and how strongly they're willing to act to protect them. It's unjust, and those people deserve our support. And are we going to have show notes below because we can post the link to the petition to have the case dismissed. They've been found guilty, but they have not yet been sentenced. So
there'll be show notes at opednews.com/podcasts, and that'll take you to your interview, and that'll be available.
Great.
You can also put it on the YouTube channel as well. You'll give it when we're done.
Yeah.
So there goes protest. Not such a great outcome there. What are the other ways?
Well,
how do we get rid of nuclear weapons?
Well, part of the problem is that they were trying to do something extreme because they feel like they're desperate. And here's why they're desperate. Because for 60 years, we've opposed nuclear weapons by arguing against them with moral arguments. And there's no question the nuclear weapons are immoral. You know, blowing up 3/4 of a city in order to destroy a radar array that's on the edge of the outskirts of the city is as immoral as it gets.
So I asked you about protest and why that's not working. And so what do we do if protest doesn't work?
So what you do is instead of arguing against nuclear weapons from a moral point of view, you argue that they're not realistic weapons, that the ideas behind keeping nuclear weapons are not realistic. You know, any 12-year-old can say, human beings make mistakes, human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence, and so deterrence will inevitably fail. And that's not an argument you can argue with. That is, you know, objectively true on the face of it. Human nature says that deterrence can't work forever. And it doesn't matter how reassuring or how much jargon experts use. And here's the thing. So I've been going out and giving talks about this and making these arguments that show that the believers of nuclear weapons are not being realistic. And since I restructured the talk to mirror the way the book is organized, I've had a series of talks where in 45 minutes, I took people from mildly or even completely skeptical to believing that eliminating nuclear weapons is absolutely necessary. I gave a talk at the Naval War College, to mid-career military guys from all the different services. And except for one Air Force intelligence woman and the guy who works in missile silos, everyone was persuaded.
And both of those have a conflict of interest.
Yeah. And the guy in the missile silos was fighting a rearguard action. He was saying, well, we should probably go down to 50 or something, you know. He was saying, just don't eliminate them all the way. I know we should eliminate them.
Don't eliminate the one that I work in.
Right, exactly.
So, you know, I think, you know.
So there's a message. If we attack this from a realism point of view, if we say, look, it's just not realistic to keep nuclear weapons. They're fake gods. They're a delusion. If instead of arguing morality, which we've tried, and it was somewhat successful, but it didn't get us all the way there, we can use these new arguments that anyone can learn, then you can persuade enough people so it's not necessary to break into the base to try and draw attention, because people will be writing into their congressman or their congresswoman. They'll be, you know, standing up at town hall meetings with senators and saying, Senator, what's with this crazy nuclear weapons stuff? That's not realism. That's just nonsense. And they'll have the arguments to back it up.
We need to take a break now.
Okay.